In this segment, I want to pick up then following a discussion of kind of culture in the 1970s and some of the tensions involved. I want to pick back up then with federal policy and talk then about the Nixon administration, but also about the Carter and the Ford administrations, not necessarily in that order. Ford and Carter is how it should be. And then I'm going to come back around at the very end of this lecture to foreign policy and set the stage, I hope, for then the following lecture, which we'll pick up with the Reagan Revolution, as it's been called. I want to start out in this segment, though, with Richard Nixon and domestic policy. And I want to go back to the economy to start. Richard Nixon, in trying to address these growing issues with the U.S. economy in the late 1960s and early 1970s, tried first to stimulate the economy with more government spending. But as you might imagine, that would have inflationary consequences. And it also began the United States, or pushed the United States further down a road toward running regular deficits, where simply not enough revenue was being brought in to cover government expenditures. 1971, however, Richard Nixon the conservative, I should say, really demonstrated that he was far more complicated than, just being a sort of symbol of conservatism or holding to conservative ideas. Because Nixon devalued the dollar by connecting it from a metal base. That's fascinating. The last time we really talked about the silver issue, you may recall, was when we talked about the Farmers Alliance and ultimately the populists in the election of 1896. Well, almost 100 years later, after Franklin Roosevelt had detached American paper currency from valuable metals, silver, I should say, Richard Nixon comes along and basically allows the U.S. dollar to float on international money markets so that the value of the dollar is determined not by any ability to translate the paper currency into actually valuable materials like gold or silver, but rather the value of the U.S. dollar really depends upon how much confidence the world has in the U.S. government and the nation. Luckily, you could argue that there has been considerable confidence in the U.S. government, though perhaps by the early 21st century that's begun to flag just a bit. Nonetheless, U.S. currency was allowed to rise and fall based upon the good faith and credit of the United States. But he went even further. In August of 1971, Richard Nixon instituted price and wage and rent freezes for 90 days to try and address the inflationary spiral that the United States had become involved in. That's an extraordinarily radical, I think, move. It's something that often you think of in terms of wartime efforts to deal with inflation, but this is a Republican president elected in no small part as a consequence of a conservative wave in American politics. And that tells us something, I think, about Richard Nixon. His rhetoric, what he said, tended to be quite conservative in tone. But it turns out that many of his policies and much of what occurred during his administrations, his two administrations, tended to be far more moderate than his rhetoric might have allowed. Though mostly the work of Congress, the Nixon administration did see some rather important pieces of legislation pass, and Nixon signed off. In response to the environmental concerns in 1970, you have the Environmental Protection Agency. You'll also have that same year the Clean Air Act passed. 1972, we'll see Water Pollution Control Act passed, which essentially is the Clean Water Act. And 1973, an Endangered Species Act passed. And that establishes, of course, protections for those species that may be endangered, including, because of DDT and what Rachel Carson wrote about, the bald eagle, the symbol of the United States, which was by the 1970s very much endangered, partly because of its softening of eggshells that DDT caused. Now, you put all this together, and so the environment. Well, why so much environmental legislation? Part of it was the fascination, the interest that had been generated in environmental issues across the U.S. But I think there's another sort of thought to hold on to here, and that's the fact that environmental concerns crossed many lines of delineation. In other words, it crossed the boundaries between radical and conservative, because many Americans, regardless of their particular political ideology or their aspirations socially or otherwise, could find in environmental concerns a sort of common purpose. And that's reflected in the willingness of both Democrats and Republicans to support, at least to some extent, federal intervention on behalf of the environment. But of course, the legislative agenda went further. And I think one of the major pieces of legislation passed under Nixon that concerns the workplace was the OSHA law. Occupational Safety and Health Administration was created by law in 1970 to govern the workplace and the safety of workers and to enforce codes. In other ways, Nixon struggled. He wanted to go further to dismantle the so-called welfare state, social programs, reduce the budget, those types of things. He fought with Congress vigorously. He also demonstrated a conservative streak in terms of busing, which had become by the early 1970s a major issue. In 1971, in the Supreme Court decision Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, 1971, Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, the Supreme Court had determined that one mode of integration of schools that was allowable was the so-called forced busing of students within a school district. That is to say, that you could actually, through busing, integrate schools, and that was allowable within a single district. Nixon resisted. He, in his rhetoric, chastised the court for this decision, but moreover, he called for a moratorium on busing. It's an interesting issue because it's an issue that really plays to that blue-collar support Nixon enjoyed. Suburban families often found themselves in distinct districts. And so often the issue of busing didn't arise in the suburbs, where it would arise within urban areas where you still had African Americans, and increasingly you would have Hispanic numbers, Asian people, Asian folks, and you put that together with the kind of white working class, and busing is a really much more of an issue sort of in the city. But the Supreme Court had said that's okay, and Nixon resists. So again, in busing at least, that's an issue where he feels he can step up and sort of display that conservative mantle. He's also going to have an effect on the Supreme Court. He will nominate Warren Burger to lead the court, replacing Earl Warren of the famous Brown decision. There was beginning to be talk that part of the problem here is a court that sort of is an activist court that's pushing along social change through judicial fiat. And Nixon begins to reshape the court. William Rehnquist will be a Nixon nominee, as well as Warren Burger and others. And so through the 1970s, the court does become somewhat more conservative. And this is something, the battle over the Supreme Court, that will continue well after the 1970s. The other thing that needs to be mentioned is how Nixon responded to sort of this radicalization that's taking place. And I mean the drug culture, but I also mean the bombings. I mentioned the Weathermen in an earlier segment. A sense of anarchy, a sense of unrest that was unsettling to the silent majority that Nixon had campaigned to in 1968, and that Nixon saw as communist inspired oftentimes, still through that lens of the Cold War. And many Americans did too, trying to unsettle and unseat the United States. Nixon will utilize institutions like the CIA and the FBI to launch coordinated attacks on what he considers to be internal threats. Now, we all know that J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, had been actively involved in similar undertakings for decades. But here you have a president of the United States who is authorizing, through the CIA and through the FBI, break-ins, illegal searches and seizures, wiretaps, and interfering with the federal mails on behalf of law and order, on behalf of security. Again, he's reaching out to his political support. He wants to be the law and order president, but there's a question already by the early 1970s, even before, about the methods that Richard Nixon is willing to use. And he will, before it's all over, organize a campaign to discredit the Democratic Party as part of what's this perceived threat to the United States, not just to Richard Nixon. We'll pick up in the next segment talking about Watergate and the culmination, and then move on to talk about both the Ford and the Carter administrations.